So my name is Grant Oliphant. I'm the president of the Heinz Endowments and the co-conspirator in this conversation that we're having. And you apparently are the stalwarts for being here this morning. I'd like to thank you for taking the time and starting for what promises to be a long and interesting day, culminating in part in a conversation with the cartoonist Rob Rogers, and you do not want to miss that. So I'm really looking forward to the day ahead of us. I had some prepared remarks to share with you, and I'm not going to use them. It struck me yesterday that most of what I wanted to say had been said, and what was left was not what was in my heart, given I'm sorry if this is rustling. Given what we have been witnessing and encountering over the last, say, 48, 72 hours. And so let me just start with an acknowledgement about the First Amendment. I'm going to talk a little bit about the last 72 hours, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about what that represents for the challenges we face in the First Amendment, and then I think what we can all do about it. So if I can remember 4 simple things, that's what I'm going to do. It may be a challenge, so somebody may have to remind me of this. But first of all, in terms of the First Amendment, I consider myself to be the least expert person on the stage around this set of issues. I've danced in and around it all my life. I grew up in a journalism household. My father is the Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial cartoonist Pat Oliphant, which is part of what's going to make my conversation with Rob so damn interesting, because I have some things to say. And I, in my 20s, had this crazy idea to launch a political magazine with a group of friends called American Politics, and we covered the White House and Congress, national politics, for about 3 years. We never made a cent, but it was an amazing experience getting to do that. And that was during the Reagan years, which was an extraordinary time in American history. And a lot of people talked about the First Amendment then. But I, to be honest, didn't think about the First Amendment in the way that I do now. Today I think about it primarily from the vantage point of community and what it means in terms of the community context. That is the focus of the work that I did at the Pittsburgh Foundation and do now at the Heinz Endowments. So let's move to the second thing, which is the issue of the First Amendment in the context of community. You know, I was distracted yesterday, as I suspect many of you were, by the events that had been happening, and I actually had to find a quiet space in the middle of the morning, so I apologize. I won't tell you whose sessions I missed, but I apologize that I ducked out, but I had to write something to express what I was feeling about the moment that we're in. And 2 things welled up for me. One was of course, what has been happening at the border. And you know, there is this sort of sham sense that emerged yesterday that the situation at the border has been settled by the signing of an unnecessary executive order that may or may not have staying power to stop separating families and to stop incarcerating children in prisons scattered around the United States. And what welled up for me was this sense of gratitude that protest had moved the equation enough to make that change, but despair over what was still left in place. And what was still left in place was a policy of zero tolerance. And you have to wonder, zero tolerance for what? Is it zero tolerance for people trying to feed their children, trying to save their lives, trying to escape oppression, trying to be, in simplest terms, human? And still left in place in the context of that decision was a whole set of lies about what's actually happening at the border in terms of the data itself. When ICE itself admits that the vast majority of asylum seekers who arrive at the border actually return for their trials if they are given the chance to be free in the meantime. And yet we're separating families and putting them in prison because we quote unquote have zero tolerance, not because it's effective, not because the data suggests it's what we should do, but because it makes us feel tough. That is pathetic, and that is what's left in place. And also left in place is a set of language about who human beings are. So we've gone from referring to these folks as murderers and rapists to now infestations. So they've gone from criminals to vermin. And as Soledad O'Brien said to a group of us at the Media Impact Funders the other day, this is the language of ethnic cleansing. And when we think that that is all left in place because none of it has been denied, it is difficult to celebrate the tiny victory of a reversal of a policy that never had to happen in the first place. The second thing that came up for me was the shooting of Antoine Rose, and it was on the mind of a lot of Pittsburghers yesterday, and apparently a lot of folks around the country, and we talked about it at this conference yesterday. But it needs to be said when it's mentioned that Antoine was a teenager who was caught in a bad situation, and he, like every teenager I can imagine, tried to run away, unarmed, black, shot 3 times in the back and killed. And the extraordinary nature of that, is people are protesting, and again, I'm so grateful that people are protesting, and I wouldn't have been grateful if I'd been one of the people sitting on the Parkway East yesterday where they shut down traffic for 5 hours, but God, I'm grateful for the energy. And yet, I'm also mindful of what's left in place here. So we're going to, you know what happens next, right? Everybody in this room knows what happens next. What happens next is that the story that will begin to circulate on cable TV and in little whispers that people in the community tell each other, primarily white people, the conversation will be, well, he had guns in his car. And they might have been involved in a crime. And yet, had those children been white, that young man would not have gotten a death sentence for running away from a car. And you know it. And you know that Black Lives Matter, which is so derided by people for focusing on issues of race, is a roar of pain against this sort of oppression, and yet left in place is the sense that this is normal. So how do we process that in the context of community, and why does it relate to the First Amendment? Max King gave, I think, a really excellent talk yesterday, and one of the things that he pointed to, and I thought the most profound part of the message, is that the First Amendment, the freedoms that it spells out, are not just a set of rights that Congress can't impede on. They're actually a playbook for how citizens maintain their freedom. So last night there was all kinds of debate on Facebook and Twitter about whether the protesters on the Parkway East were having any sort of effect. Whether people assembling to express their voice at the county courthouse would have any sort of effect. And the answer is that that's a whole lot more likely to have an effect than the nothing we would do if we didn't have these mechanisms of action. Why this becomes important, why it matters for a community is partly because of what's going on at the national level. And if you think about what's happening with President Trump and the language that he uses, he's been very explicit about targeting the press and the media, and made them a year ago the enemy of the people. But in a symbolic moment so staggering it was hard to process, he comes back from North Korea, the world's most brutal dictatorship, and says that the greatest enemy facing American society is you people, a free press. And we've seen language like this before. It paves the way for every kind of autocracy in the world. And then accompanied by a wish that his people would stand at attention like they do for the dictator of North Korea. And this has it is so tempting for people to say, well, that's just what he says, and that's just presidential politics. But words matter, and this is way more than presidential politics, because the culture is ingesting this and internalizing this, and it taps into influences that have existed in the culture for decades. This generation and this president did not invent prejudice, did not invent bias, did not invent the desire we all have to wish away the bad parts of our soul and pretend they don't exist. Those exist in us, and they emerge when they're given permission to emerge. And they always, always, always start by trying to impede on our First Amendment freedoms. So a couple of examples when you think about the handling of the news around the border and the stuff that was happening in the border. Why do you think it was that the press became attacked in the context of their reporting around that? It was simply because they were telling the truth. And if you think about the moment where this shifted culturally and the American people rose up in a loud voice to say that this was unacceptable, it was actually, I think, the moment when ProPublica released audio tape sharing the voice of children in pain. That and the photograph of the little 2-year-old girl crying by her mother's side as she was being arrested by ICE agents. So the free press becomes the target because they are the vehicle by which the population can understand what's going on and begin to speak up about it. I wrote down a couple of other examples that I thought were important because we tend to think about this purely in terms of national politics and at a moment, at a particular moment in time. But I had the opportunity a month ago to interview Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who is the pediatrician who brought the crisis of lead poisoning in Flint to the nation's attention. And in our interview, one of the things that Dr. Mona pointed out was that from the moment she started to investigate the facts, and she's not a member of the media, but she is a citizen capable of exercising her First Amendment rights to speak, and in this case, for her, backed up by science. And the first thing that happened to her when she began to talk about the science of what she was finding was that she was attacked as a doctor, she was attacked as a scientist, and she was attacked as a person. And the vicious attempt was made to silence her and to shame her into being quiet, to the point that she came this far from deciding to back off. But something in her said she couldn't do that. And what eventually emerged was that her science was correct and the state's science was completely wrong. And as a result, we've discovered that an American city poisoned through a deliberate policy choice tens of thousands of its own children. So when we think about what's happening at the border in the context of this is something that's not us, we do it to our own children. And the mechanism for fighting it almost always lies in the context of the First Amendment freedoms that we're able to exercise. I was thinking about how resonant that is with climate science and what happens on the national level with the staggering way in which this government is wishing away science itself and suggesting that truth is not truth, that there is a completely alternate reality, and that there is something wrong and evil about the people and the scientists who are trying to spread the truth of what their research shows. So this happens on matters of national policy that don't seem as obviously about hot button issues like discrimination, but just ones that get in the way of whatever those in power want. You know, I've watched the emergence, because we've been an early funder of this organization along with the Pittsburgh Foundation and several of our colleagues, watched the emergence of public source in our town. And one of the most, well, I'll say, the organization I get the most complaints about as a funder is public source. And I love that. Because, but what happens, so you think of this is about Washington, this is about the party in power in Washington. This is about power. And the temptation of people in power is always, whether they be in business or government or philanthropy sometimes, the temptation of people in power is to make unpleasantness go away. So if you're bothering me with lots of right-to-know requests and annoying articles about what I'm doing wrong, I'm going to try to shut you down. Well, not I, but that's the temptation. And when I look around the experience that reporters in this town have had at the Post-Gazette, at the Tribute Review, when they were doing more daily reporting here, this was not just public source. I heard about it because we were a funder of public source. But reporters will share stories night and day about the ways in which the powerful have attempted to shut them down. So we have to recognize that this is a national to a state to a local dynamic. The impulse of authorities is so often to clamp down in silence. And sometimes that's just a normal kind of process, and people resist it. And publishers do their jobs sometimes. And they protect their journalists, and they allow the work to get done. But it becomes harder and harder and harder in the midst of a cultural ethos that seems to make that evil and venal and wrong. And it takes more and more courage in that sort of environment. And the question becomes, well, what can we do about it? What is the antidote? And actually, this is something we debate a lot when we as a foundation help host a conference like this, and Max and I and our teams spoke a lot about what's the takeaway. And unfortunately, the takeaway for this conference is more for you. It's not about what we're going to do. We intend to stay at this issue and continue to raise its profile. We'll be supporting a follow-up conference at Duquesne University later this year. We intend to continue to speak out about the issues that are of concern to us. But the answer is that the way in which we respond to a moment like this is to lean into exercising the freedoms that are spelled out in the First Amendment. So that does mean things like assembly before the courthouse. And it does mean organizing and protesting and advocacy. It does mean being undaunted by official attempts to silence and clamp down and make us go away. And it does mean being willing to petition the government and ask it to do its job. And when I think about the moment we're in as a people, and the stakes are extraordinary. And I just am so grateful to all of you in this room for wanting to be a part of the solution, of wanting to drive a different kind of behavior. But most of all, I'm going to ask you to hold people accountable. The only way we will counter the sort of language that we're seeing used nationally and locally, the only way that we will counter the rise of white supremacist movements. Honest to God, my grandmother was a member of the Dutch resistance and sheltered a young Jewish girl in her house for a year, and my mother and she nearly died to fight the Nazis. And I never in my life thought I'd see the emergence of Nazis in the United States of America, but here we are. And the antidote to that, I believe, is going to be that we fundamentally change how we view not the First Amendment, which is the tool, but how we view compassion. And there's this crazy sort of stupid idea that has dominated our society for a while, and I blame Facebook because they're easy. Um, but the idea is that compassion is something we feel. That you are moved to do a compassionate act because I identify with you. You look like me. Well, you're probably offended by that, but we identify with people, and they're a member of our tribe, and they vote like us, and they think like us, and they talk like us. So they're the ones I will help. And if I feel motivated to do if I feel compassionate, then I'll be compassionate. But there's a whole school of thought. There's a wonderful notion expressed in an ancient Buddhist text that compassion is sharing the best of what you do with everyone. It uses the same verb as the golden rule, which is that you should do unto others. It doesn't say feel unto others. It says do unto others. The shift we have to make as a society that likes to fancy itself compassionate and caring is that is only true in the doing. And until our society embraces a willingness to act on its supposed compassionate impulses and to do it across the abysses that divide us, then we're not a compassionate society. Compassion happens in the doing. And the way we do it, and here's the tool part, is actually through those rights spelled out in the First Amendment. So I hope as we go through today that you'll be thinking about the amendment in the context, not just as a set of entitlements we as citizens have, but as a set of obligations we have if we want to create the sort of society that I think the folks in this room ultimately do. So thank you for being here.